NASA did their best through a series of many, many half-truths and some outright lies to make it sound like it was an accident. And that's bullshit, because it was a horrible disaster, but not an accident. When you got people that are your technical experts jumping up and down, raising hell, trying to stop the launch, and being ignored, you can't then, when something goes wrong, turn around and say it was an accident, or it was a bad judgment call, or this or that. Listen, I want to tell you that I was held in such high esteem. At this point in time, I was the technical troubleshooter on the solid rocket boosters concerning the structural cases. I had nothing to do with propellant or the nozzle, but those cases were my baby. And when something went wrong, it was my job to make damn sure that the trouble was ferreted out and fixed. And the decisions that I made carried a great deal of weight, except on the night that we were trying to stop the Challenger launch. By that time, it didn't matter what the hell I said, because they had already made up their minds before the telecon started that they were going to do everything in their power to make us back down so that they could get an approval for launch. When I did that inspection on the two boosters on the 15th flight, 2 out of the 6 joints had massive hot gas past the primary seal. And although none escaped to atmosphere, as indicated by a pristine secondary seal, which had worked in both instances, we had never seen anything like this before on any flight.
The discriminator, he believed, was the cold. He remembered seeing on the TV the day before that the weatherman was reporting temperatures up to 53 degrees Fahrenheit, and that the citrus crops were going to be destroyed and the citrus trees would have to be replanted because of the cold. He presented his findings to Thiokol. He was asked to present these to NASA and basically show that the photographs, he showed him the swabs that he used to take samples of the blackened grease that had occurred. And he says, I believe that the temperature was the discriminator. They did some preliminary tests with steel plates and some O-rings themselves, trying to mimic this, what could have happened. They also found there could be seal failures at room temperature, but at the much colder temperatures, you would get much more blow-by, much more blackened grease, much more gases shooting past the primary seal. Now, a couple months later, there was another incident. I think it was the 17th flight. There was a faulty leak check, and the primary O-ring failed and eroded the secondary O-ring. And this prompted him to write this report, which he submitted to his superior. His name was R.K. Lund. And basically said, what happened here is this primary O-ring failed, and the secondary O-ring in the nozzle joint was eroded. And he said, if the same thing should happen in a field joint, you see you got the field joints and you got the nozzle joints. He said, if the same thing should happen in a field joint, then it's the jump ball as to the success or failure of the joint, because the secondary O-ring cannot respond to the clevis opening rate and may not be capable of pressurization. The result will be a catastrophe of the highest order, a loss of human life. And he wrote that in July of 1985. He sent that off to his superiors. This was stamped company private, so he couldn't really share this with NASA or anybody else, you see. But what he did do, he took a copy of that and he whited out the company private and showed it to some of his close colleagues. He didn't give them a copy, just let them read it. And basically, he wanted them to know that he had put his management under full written notice that if they didn't solve this problem, they were going to be basically playing Russian roulette with the lives of the astronauts. I haven't posted this on Ofthe, but I've posted the interview with Boisjoly on my YouTube channel. And so basically, then Challenger comes along. This is a year after the Discovery incident, which we had the 53 degrees Fahrenheit launch, and they're concerned about launching in freezing weather. They get a phone call from some guy down at the Cape asking, are we concerned about launching in cold weather? When Boisjoly heard that, he went nuts, and so they got their superiors together, and they telephoned the people at NASA, basically saying, we don't think it's safe to launch in cold weather. Now, I need to pause for a second and basically explain how these pre-flight hearings actually work, you see. Normally, NASA, they speak to the contractors. They say, are we safe to launch tomorrow? Or are we safe to launch in this particular time? They say either yes or no. If they say yes, then NASA basically interrogates the contractor, basically makes damn sure that they are very 100% confident in what they're saying, make sure they are very clear in their recommendations, make sure they're on very, very firm ground. Normally, if they say, no, we're not ready to launch, NASA says, okay, launch is cancelled, we basically postpone it to later. This time it was the reverse. When they say we don't believe it's safe to launch in cold weather, NASA said prove it's not safe to launch. And so they wanted this full-blown flight readiness review within less than an hour. And so Boisjoly and his colleagues, they all grabbed whatever pieces of material, whatever papers, whatever photos they could to basically present this report, present this presentation over the phone, have them faxed to the people at NASA. There was the people at the Marshall Space Flight Center and the Kennedy Space Center, and they basically presented all this material to them. And normally if they say we're not safe to launch, that's the end of the matter. That's the end of the discussion. But now suddenly there was a debate about it, about not being safe to launch in cold weather. They presented these findings, and the head guy at the Marshall Space Flight Center, his name was Larry Malloy, he started saying things that the data was inconclusive. He challenged them to try and prove that. When he asked for their recommendations, first of all, the first recommendation came from Joe Kilminster at Thiokol. Boisjoly, he had about a 50% confidence that Kilminster would stand by their original data because he's sort of a wimp. Boisjoly told me he's sort of a wimpy manager, you see. But to his surprise, he said to Malloy, our position is we do not feel comfortable launching at a temperature below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so that's the first no vote to launch. And Malloy, he wasn't happy with this decision, so he basically turned to George Hardy, who's a NASA guy from Harding, from Marshall Space Flight Center. Boisjoly actually explains to me, he says, people on the outside, they don't know who George Hardy was, but he was basically at the Marshall Center years before NASA became an agency. No, he was basically like the Desmond Llewellyn of the Marshall Space Flight Center. He'd been there from almost the beginning, you see. And so his decisions carried a great deal of weight. His recommendations, his thoughts on this, and he had basically said he was appalled by the no-launch recommendation. Yeah, but at the same time, he also added, I'm appalled by this no-launch recommendation, but I can't overrule the contractor. So basically, he would only agree to launch if the contractor said it was safe to launch. And they just said it was not safe to launch. And Malloy, he basically says something to the extent, why are you guys trying to come up with launch commit criteria on the eve of the launch? When do you want me to launch next April? Now, during the investigations that followed, the Thiokol managers, they would say that they felt no pressure. They felt no intimidation.
You didn't feel that they were trying to get you to change your mind?
I did not feel a significant amount of pressure in that regard.
Well, I'm telling you that's absolute 100% pure bullshit. Because if they felt no pressure, why did they think it was necessary to convene a caucus to reevaluate the data? They felt pressure. Everybody in the room felt pressure. I felt pressure as a major presenter, as an engineer, trying to stop the launch. And I was crushed when they asked for the caucus, and it was granted.
After Malloy starts making these statements about when do you want me to launch, in April, Thiokol managers, they requested to go offline to reevaluate the data. And it was clear from what they were discussing, the Thiokol managers, that they were basically trying to sketch out some reasons to justify a launch. Because their next contract is still under development, you see, and they feared that their contracts could be in jeopardy. When it appeared like they were changing their minds, the engineers tried to intervene to try and make them stick to their original recommendations. His former boss, named Al Thompson, he gets up and basically sketches out a field joint, basically explaining the dangers of launching in the cold weather, and they just ignored him like he wasn't even there. He was so pissed off by the way they treated Arnold Thompson that Boisjoly, he got up, he slammed the photographs on the table. He had two sets of photographs. He had the photographs that he had personally taken of the 53 degrees Fahrenheit launch, and he had a second set of photographs, which was from the 22nd flight, which was room temperature. Okay, the 22nd flight had some blow-by here, some blow-by there, you know, some little black stuff, and whereas the 53 degrees Fahrenheit launch was just completely black. Blow-by had shot past the primary seal.
I mean, it was clear that the gas past the seal on Flight 22 at room temperature wasn't anything even close to the volume of gas past the seal in the 15th flight at a seal temperature of 53 degrees.
He was told after the thing that he was literally screaming at the managers, basically telling them to look at the photographs, and that the more black you see in these pictures, that's the low temperature. That's the effects of low temperature. The colder the temperature, the more blow-by you're going to get. And now we're talking about launching in freezing weather, a condition where neither the primary seal nor the secondary seal is going to function. They ignored him just like they ignored Arnold Thompson. And so when it was clear he wasn't going to listen to, he just sat back in his seat and, you know, sit down and shut up, and was basically trying to just really contain his anger because he felt like he could have just punched one of those out at that point. Yeah. The Thiokol managers, they decided amongst themselves. They had a vote amongst only the four managers. The vice president of engineering, he was the last one to make the vote. And his superior actually told him to take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. Okay, and so eventually they all agreed to launch. They went back on the line. They told NASA, okay, the recommendation is go for launch. And to NASA, that wasn't even good enough. They wanted it in writing. They had them fax a written agreement to go to launch, and they had sketched out all these reasons where they used to justify it. But if you look at the actual recommendations they have, there's literally nothing on the page that can justify a launch. In fact, it's literally much of the same things that they brought up beforehand, and there's some outright falsehoods that were added there. Like they say, engineering assessment has concluded yada, yada, yada. Well, there was no engineering input in regards to making this decision. It was purely managers amongst themselves.
I was just going to say something just for clarification for people that are listening. The temperature during that night before the launch was down below freezing. At 11 o'clock in the morning, they're still waiting for the ice to melt off of the vehicle. Mm-hmm. So the vehicle itself was still frozen, and it was 36 degrees Fahrenheit or 2 degrees Celsius at launch. So yes, that's well below the 53 degrees where they're already showing some serious problems.
The engineers who were objecting to the launch, obviously there was Boisjoly, then there was Arnold Thompson, there was another fellow by the name of Bob Ebeling, and then there was Brian Russell. He's the youngest of the engineers. He only said about 2 words during the thing. He was the youngest presenter. He was the guy who presented the pictures from the 22nd launch. And over at the Cape was Al McDonald, who was the first whistleblower. You see, after the Challenger disaster happened, NASA, they acted as if the only recommendation to launch was it was safe to launch. We contacted Firecold and they said it was safe to launch. They never said anything about the initial launch. It was actually Al McDonald who basically raised his hand up and basically interjected and saying our original recommendation was not to launch. And so after that, McDonald and also Boisjoly in particular, because he actually presented the smoking gun memos basically showing that they were concerned about launching a full year before the Challenger disaster, and they all got treated as whistleblowers. In fact, they started to refer to themselves as the 5 lepers because they were treated as if they had leprosy. No one wanted to touch them anymore, you see. One of the things that strikes me, in particular what Boisjoly actually said in his interview to me, he told me the managers, they went ahead and committed to a launch knowing full well they were playing Russian roulette with the lives of the astronauts.
They went ahead and committed to a launch knowing full well that they were playing Russian roulette with the lives of the astronauts. Only the type of Russian roulette they were playing was instead of having a 6-gun with 1 bullet in the 6 chambers, they had a 6-gun that was loaded with 6 bullets, and they were praying like hell that when they pulled the trigger, the gun would jam.
Those are his exact words. I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, that's much the same as the conclusion that Richard Feynman reached. He was on the Challenger inquiry, and he made the rather sensible decision to go and speak to the actual people who were assembling these solid fuel boosters and asking them, not their managers, who were all gung-ho and trying to do what President Reagan at the time, who was promoting this idea of sending a civilian teacher into space. So it's all a PR exercise to begin with. And Richard Feynman's famous last sentence in his report, which had to be included separately as an appendix to the Challenger inquiry, because they wouldn't accept it, despite the requirements of PR, nature cannot be fooled. And you've described why nature cannot be fooled. If it's too cold, things don't work.
Yeah. As Boisjoly put it, this is not rocket science. This is literally engineering 101. As he said, you could present this stuff to a housewife and it would be perfectly clear. I go a bit further and say you could go on Sesame Street and present this in very simple terms and the kids at home watching will get it. And we got these managers with decades worth of experience behind them and they don't seem to grasp that this is a problem. Boisjoly mentioned something else during his interview to me, in that if he had gone public with his company private memo, he would have been released, and that release would have come not from Firecold, but from NASA. You see, the head of the Marshall Space Flight Center, the director there, his name was William Lucas. As Boisjoly put it, he ran that division like it was a Gestapo prison camp. He said he wasn't exaggerating when he says that because he had the authority to reach into the contractors and basically crush people's careers. And so people were very, very scared to speak up about the problems that they were experiencing because Lucas had basically said the Marshall Space Flight Center would never, ever, ever be held responsible for delaying a flight. And so he had put a great pressure on people to, sweep things under the rug and make things look more rosy. This is an exact words. I've never had to do this before in an interview, but I actually had to ask somebody if I could quote him on this because Boisjoly, he said to me, after he reiterated what Lucas had basically declared, that they would never be held responsible for delaying a launch, Boisjoly remarked, "That is sick. A guy like that should have been taken out and shot right on the spot." I was absolutely astonished when Boisjoly said that, and I said, "Can I quote you on that?" And he says, "Sure you can."
He had his people under him scared to death because he could crush their career in a heartbeat. And he had basically stated that the Marshall Space Flight Center would never, ever be responsible for delaying a launch. Now that's sick. A guy like that should have been taken out and shot right on the spot.
Can I quote you on that?
Sure you can.
Cool.
I was absolutely shocked when he said that. Just astonishing, really. That kind of disregard for flight safety was allowed to take place.
Yeah, it's similar to the comments made during a discussion at Autographica about 10 years ago, when I think it was Al Warden was being questioned. He was being asked about the re-entry procedure. Basically, he said of the flight director at the time, if we could do it, we'd take him out and feed him to a bomb. That conjures up that famous image of Dr. Strangelove piloting the bomb down to Earth, riding the bomb, waving his hat. Great image, but it's going to destroy things. So feeding people to a bomb is basically, we didn't like what he was doing, whether it was to do with the difference between a direct entry and a bounced entry, where you bounce off the atmosphere to reduce the speed, which they didn't do on Apollo. So the same sort of attitude, we feed him to a bomb, seemed to be the prevailing view of the astronauts.
Given the way things were run under Lucas, I don't know how things were run under his predecessors, but it does make you wonder if, considering that kind of disregard that was going on, all these efforts to try to make things look rosy, try to sweep things under the rug, all these cover-ups that were going on, it does make you wonder how things were going on during Apollo program, considering that Van Allen had originally said things like the radiation would have been a massive hazard to the astronauts, and suddenly it's all clear. There's all these problems, suddenly they all just go away. Yeah. It makes you wonder.
It's the old political thing, isn't it? Because I say something, it will happen. I mean, that's what we got in the UK at the moment with the government. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. Just because you say it doesn't mean to say it's going to happen that way. It's same in Australia, where you've got this ridiculous censorship of young people now. Seems to be causing a lot of problems. Just because you say you're going to do it doesn't mean to say it's going to work.
For the record, I should say that Boisjoly, he didn't believe that the moon missions were faked. He had actually worked at Long Island where they were manufacturing the LEM. He believed that if they were going to do smoke and mirrors, as he put it, they wouldn't throw all that money into this lie. I disagree to that extent. Obviously, they've thrown gobs amount of money into lies. Look at all the money they threw into the claims of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, for example, and stuff. The government will throw whatever they can to push a narrative. I'm sure Boisjoly believed that the moon missions were real. He probably wouldn't have wanted to believe those sort of things. But of course, I wasn't going to, push him along those lines because he was driven to post-traumatic stress disorder. I didn't want him to give him something else to feel upset about.
Fair enough.
NASA has a history of being less than truthful about their screw-ups. Just like they did on Apollo. They said the astronauts at Apollo, on the Apollo fire, died instantly, which is, in fact, absolutely not true. They died an excruciating, painful death as they were inhaling flaming oxygen. That's how they operated. That's how they still operate. Columbia happened for the same reason the Challenger happened, because you had two managers that were hell-bent to say that everything was okay and just come home. And they burned up and killed the astronauts once again, all because they canceled a $200,000 check of the vehicle from space and or from the ground. And one of the top managers, I think her name was Mia Hamm, canceled that request. Listen, we got such good optics that we can do stuff from space and from the ground that people would be horrified. I mean, they can tell you if you have hamburgers or hot dogs on a grill, from space. Mm-hmm. So they had the resolution capability to actually spot any damage that was there, but the decision was made by the program managers not to do it because everything was okay. How could 2 pounds of density foam cause any damage to the leading weight? Well, during that investigation, they found out that a piece of 2-pound density foam propelled at Mach 0.8 blew a hole in the leading edge of the wing that was approximately a foot in diameter. Mm-hmm. And so, once again, all the hype about flight safety was just a mirage. And 7 more astronauts paid with their lives for that mirage. I was furious when people would refer to it as an accident, because it wasn't an accident. Horrible disaster, yes, but not an accident. An accident is something that just occurs out of the blue. But when you have something that is known ahead of time to have a high potential of being a disaster, you sure as hell can't call it an accident just because stupid people went ahead and made a stupid decision. I would have really liked to have seen the 4 backhaul managers and the upper echelon managers at the Marshall Space Flight Center be charged with either voluntary or involuntary manslaughter. I would have really loved to have seen that happen, and the reason being is not because I wanted to get back at them, and please understand that that was not the motive and would never be the motive, but I wanted to get the attention of people in these positions that they cannot just cavalier make decisions based on their profit line, their profit motive, and disregard the number one priority in these programs, which was flight safety, without paying a price. So that's my personal feeling. I think that they made a mistake by not putting some of the people away during Apollo days, and they repeated that same mistake with Challenger and also Columbia.
I think we made it earlier when we were talking with Robert, but what Scott has found, who's searched so many of the PDFs looking for information, and what he's finding is that, yes, a lot of testing was done. There's no doubt about that. And reports were written, there's no doubt about that, and they showed up the problems that had been discovered, because these were serious companies doing the research. They say, yes, there will be problems. Now, one specific area was to do with the photographic film being used. Yeah, the photographic film was examined and it was tested under the conditions they expected it to be operating under, and found that it caused problems, that there was fogging of the film. There was damage to the film by the radiation, by the vacuum. The vacuum wasn't known about very much at the time. This was all written up. People knew about the difficulties. And as Scott has said, where are the PDFs showing what action was taken to overcome the discovered problems? And they don't exist. It's as if, yeah, we found the problem. This is what the problem is. With photographic film, if you put it under certain conditions, it will be damaged. Okay, accept that. Now, what have you done to overcome those problems? That research and those PDFs don't exist.
I think it was on What Happened on the Moon. David Groves did some experiments exposing photographic film to X-rays, low-level X-rays, and he found that even a small dose would have been enough to significantly fog the film.
Yeah, well, look what I did with this here. I mean, I put one roll of film. I took all the pictures, but I put it outside the microwave oven here. And I poked 2 chopsticks in the door switches. You have to shut the magnetron on. I just put it on for 1 second, put the film about that far outside the door on the counter, hit it with a burst, and look at it. This is that black and white film, that high altitude film, that 168, which I purchased. Look at how it fogged.
Interesting. I have a question. Have you been able to acquire any SO243 film?
I only had the 168.
Yeah, that's understandable. I would really love to see a cross comparison with the SO243 film. That is the film that they said they carried on Lunar Orbiter and also the Voyager missions. That film is actually considered to be more resistant to radiation than the film they had on Apollo. Apollo was essentially off-the-shelf film for all intents and purposes, whereas the SO243 supposedly can take up to 100 rads to become 50% fogged. Something about the additional layering that it has or something like that. I don't know the exact details. I found a document describing this film. I haven't had a chance to read it from start to finish, but it's very interesting that was specifically selected for the Lunar Orbiter because of its resistance to radiation. Even then, they still had it in pressurized vault, to make sure it would function correctly. And they would promptly develop it and scan it and send it, before it had any chance to get significantly damaged or whatnot. And so,
when you find that, send us a copy of it. I have every PDF file on the film out there, and I've never seen that.
Yeah, we were just looking at that this morning. I went over one of these documents with the film. I believe there was 10 rolls of film I bought. 3 were 168s. Apparently, that was the one that they were using to test with radiation, and they said it fogged, and I can concur that it fogged.
With all the PDF files I've got on film, the first development I've ever seen of them putting additional anything on a film for a coating to protect it in any way, shape, or form was after 1975. Because I want to see what the actual date was on this file, because there's so many updates.
That's the problem.
So many updates, and that's where the problem is, because I have stuff from the 60s when this is going on, and there was nothing about the film.
I do bring this up because I find it very interesting. You remember that interview with Jan Lundberg, who was talking about the camera. Oh, well, it must have been the film that was special, but then they spoke to J.P. Arnold about the film they used. He said it was essentially ordinary film. It must have been the camera that was special. So you put these two people in a room together, they probably would be. What are you talking about? I thought you had the material. I thought you had this. This is just weird. Neither of them understood that this film was unprotected, essentially, for all intents and purposes. And so when they talk about they using ordinary film on the Apollo, if they got this film that's supposed to be radiation resistant, you would have thought they would have made that mandatory to carry aboard the Apollo missions. Instead, they're using off-the-shelf film.
That's not what he said. When David Percy had Doug Arnold on the show, and he actually said the only difference in that film was the grain was finer and the polyester film, the plastic, was thinner so that they could get 200 shots on the roll. But that's it. It just had a finer grain. No radiation protection, no high altitude film stuff, no anything. That's the only two things he said that they did to that film.
I just sent them some pictures of one of the cameras that they used inside the LEM. That's for Apollo 11. It even has, if you look at the one of them, it has the back of the magazine, shows you the film that's in that camera. It also has settings on the top of it. If you look on the top of it, for Earth, for the moon, for the Terminator, all of those distances are in there. They're listed on the top of it. And it also says, remove the slide before you put the thing on. That is one of the strangest things that it's actually printed on there. But that's one of the ones that they used inside. That's a Hasselblad that they used inside the LEM, not on the lunar surface.
I actually tried to get a hold of one of those cameras. Matter of fact, I contacted the Hasselblad company, and this is kind of funny. They told me that the only cameras they had available were the ones that were supposedly left on the moon. He said to me, if you happen to go by there, just pick one of them up.
Try approaching Hasselblad UK, because they've got a replica which I've used on television. That's the one I photograph in the talk I do. I show the pictures of it. That chap who was in David's film, that was A.J.P. Arnold, I think it was, who's the managing director of Kodak in the UK. So he should know what he was talking about, especially going to be interviewed by somebody like David, who knew the questions to ask. What was the film used? Where did it come from? And he got the answer he was expecting. Came off the shelf. Normal stuff, bit thin. You get 200 into a magazine.
People need to know about radiation because NASA makes it disappear conveniently. Moon rocks don't have radiation. This does. Oh, the Van Allen belts. Well, that's not a problem. Oh, solar flares. Those aren't a problem. We don't even bother to mention it. They're having stuff flying around.
This is the book that Rene had cited in NASA Moon America. It's out of print now. This is by John Malden. He had made similar statements in regards to how much shielding you would need, the extent that you would need 2 meters of shielding, to shield against the solar flares and the like. And so in cosmic rays as well, of course, the cosmic rays, the more immediate problem is the solar flares, because the cosmic rays they discuss about being an issue for longer missions. But of course, you can look at the data from Artemis 1. Even if you calculate for the days that the Apollo was supposed to be in there, you find that Artemis was still detecting much more radiation per day than Apollo. And that's despite it having 3 times as much shielding.
That's Artemis 1, isn't it? December 2014, which might explain why there's very little talk now of Artemis 2, which is supposed to be flying around the moon with 4 astronauts on board. Maybe they've been asking questions. What protection are we being given, Mr. NASA? We heard that radiation can be quite harmful.
I was actually at the press conference when everybody was asking questions about the heat shield because it sustained much more damage than they were expecting. There were huge chunks of it coming off it. And my question was about the radiation. I was looking at the solar weather. I was looking at there was like 3 solar flares during the mission. I had asked them what was the readouts as far as proton flux and energy. How well did this shield against those solar flares? And the guy, his name was Mark Hugh, if I recall correctly, he was the project manager for the Orion capsule. His response was basically, you know more about those flares than I do.
Shit. Wow.
It's very reassuring.
Really?
And he just doubled down on, we got detectors, we got shielding, and this will be very important going forward into this project. Not very reassuring. For all the other questions about the heat shields, they would give, detailed answers, lasting very many minutes and stuff, to each of the reporters. But in my case, my question, his answer was less than a minute. It was like he was just trying to get it over and done with as soon as possible.
Maybe the astronauts understood what you were asking, and they started asking their own questions.
But this one here is a great PDF to go over.
This is nice color photographs. This is not an original document of any kind, so I'm going to compare it against some of the originals, especially on these window seals. Oh, it's completely different.
You know, but Raza said that as far as it goes for the seals, you know, for the ISS and things like that, he says that that is a special rubber that lasts at least 30 years.
Put it in a California sun at the beach.
But I'm more interested in that capsule going to the moon because that was in minus 11 to 12. Now, how the hell can a rubber seal that when Bill Demos at the university have to use those one-time metal seals when they go over -6?
Yeah, this is a nice updated document. No, I haven't seen this one. It has a whole new thing on the heat shield and everything else. It's even designed differently on this one for the ablative shielding.
I think the film document is also something worth looking at for probably a future discussion.
Yeah.